know you've been waiting for this as far back as my Anne Boleyn rankings, and I have been very excited to present it to you. Catherine Howard is a fascinating yet obscure person because she was raised in mystery and died so young. When dramas cover all 6 wives of Henry VIII, she tends to get a tad more screen time than everyone else, save for Anne Boleyn, of course. So we'll have more to say here than we did about Anna of Cleves. Once again, we're straying into that area where we are fascinated by the stories of those whose lives were tragically cut short. There is more power than you know in the lives they didn't have, the decisions they never made, the birthdays they never had. So many people, for one reason or another, didn't get to grow old, and Catherine Howard was one of them. Our interpretation of this tragedy is twisted, to say the least, and the reason behind these is the double standard in regards to young female sexuality. The male gaze desires arousal from the young and firm females, but positive female sexuality is bad for some reason, so we have to condemn any woman who enjoys such pleasures. The result? A jumbled mess, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to go into as much depth as possible, give these interpretations an intense look and maybe even surprise you. Hey, you waited this long, why not make it something worth watching? While we're here, I'm also going to look at how Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham are portrayed in these respective dramas. In Dereham's case, he doesn't have enough on-screen portrayals to meet the 5 version minimum, and Culpeper is too obscure to warrant a full coverage, and I'd only be repeating myself, as we only ever associate him with Catherine Howard. So let's go. Who was the best Catherine Howard?
Your Majesty.
Come here. What did you say your name was again?
Catherine, Your Grace.
Catherine Howard.
Here's the short version of this segment.
Deep hurting. Deep hurting.
And now here's the long version. This was truly a surreal experience. This doesn't feel like Emily Blunt. Not the one I know, anyway. This segment of the hellhole that is this mini-series is, you know, the words are there, but actually sorting them into place is frustratingly difficult. Writing this script took several attempts, I assure you. It's like a failed Sci-Fi Channel adaptation of Game of Thrones. Watching this genuinely felt as if someone was adapting A Song of Ice and Fire to cash in on the Lord of the Rings hype, and they cast Emily Blunt as Sansa Stark. To save on time, and because these creators care less than those 2 hacks off Game of Thrones, Sansa and Cersei Lannister were mushed into the same character. So you have this inconsistent mishmash of, oh, I am so innocent and pure, versus I am sexually licentious and I'm proud of it. Granted, I was watching this with the terrible Game of Thrones finale still casting its vast shadow over nerd culture, so this comparison was inevitable, but given how eerily Emily sounds like Sophie Turner in this, I could not avoid putting them together in my mind.
My lord, please. I beg you, don't worry. It was just one night. It's all right. I won't tell anyone.
Since my father was executed, I have been a hostage in King's Landing. A plaything for Joffrey to torture or Queen Cersei to torment.
I think I have to take back what I said in the Anne Boleyn rankings, that if Six the Musical was about the queens competing over who was portrayed the worst in this series, Anne would win. I was wrong. Catherine Howard not only wins, but she also needs a lot of therapy, and a hug, and a blanket, and as much chamomile tea as is safe for a human to consume. You can find the measure of the writer or showrunner by how they decide to introduce their characters. And with female characters, it can be striking and sometimes irritatingly predictable. And Peter Morgan introducing Catherine Howard in the middle of doing it with Francis Dereham, showing her body bathed in moonlight, splayed over the bed to look sexy and moaning a little too theatrically.
She's faking it.
Really shows how he sees this character. She's not there to be a character, she's a plot device with tiny boobs. And by sexing her up, we keep the husbands who agreed to watch this with their wives happy, so they can watch Match of the Day later uninterrupted. This is what Dara O'Brien calls something for the dads.
Now, something for the dads is that really irritating phenomenon of putting in totty into all kind of shows, particularly family shows, because it's presumed it's the only way I'll keep watching.
I tell you what, The Laughing Cavalier didn't warn me about the part when Catherine is introduced to the Duke of Norfolk and he literally pulls down her shift to examine her boobs. Of all the hot and heavy historical dramas that I've seen, I have never known a more pathetic excuse for nudity. Obviously, this was a direct lift from The Six Wives of Henry VIII, where the Duke studies and cross-examines Catherine to see if she'll do as his pawn. Before then, Catherine tells one of her friends about her affair with Derham. In the same manner as copy-pasting something off Wikipedia and using the thesaurus tool in Microsoft Word in the hopes your teacher won't notice, Henry VIII 2003 decided they must make dramatic scenes just to get a rise out of the audience, not to actually tell a cohesive story. You can see how I made a connection between this and the worst parts of Game of Thrones, right? And once again, I hate these costumes so much. They are so ugly, they literally hurt me. And it hurts even more now because back in early October, I watched Gone with the Wind for the first time. And whether you love that movie or you hate it, one of the redeeming features of the movie is that the costumes in that film are not only accurate to the time period, but they are visually spectacular. So I was pretty damn spoiled there. And then I come back to a drama that was so contemptuous when it came to costume design. It felt like a goddamn insult. Catherine wears two dresses in this. The first is this semi-accurate gold and white dress, although some guys claim it's black and blue, and the other is this hideous nightdress. But it can't be a nightdress because she wears it in public, but it can't be a Tudor gown because it isn't even cut like one. The thing with Henry VIII 2003 is that it thinks that the audience doesn't want to see boring costumes, so they put inaccurate costumes on the main characters while skipping out accurate headwear so they have their hair on full display. But the thing is, the extras are actually wearing more accurate clothing. As a result, the main characters stand out like a sore thumb, but not in a good way. For goodness sake, I just want some nice bloody costumes. I have the same problem with the Anne Boleyn 2021 costumes as well. They're just so boring. You do not understand the Tudor era. Like, even though the costumes in the Tudors weren't accurate, they still look pretty damn good, even the dresses on the extras. You have this whole scene where Henry's got a bunch of ladies coming over to dinner and you don't see these women anywhere else, and you don't see these costumes, but you know that these were intricately made. They look really, really nice, even if they aren't historically accurate. And they all had Tudoresque elements. But this series, it just hates nice things. I can't say much for Francis Derham in this, because the scene where he's shagging Catherine is the only scene that he's in. So there's no hanging, drawing and quartering, which is weird, because they really like showing all the gory shit, but, you know, no hanging, drawing and quartering, just beheadings. ITV is weird. The BBC would have done it, just saying. Okay, so let's look at Thomas Culpeper instead. He's certainly there. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't even remember where Culpeper first appeared. The camera work is so terrible that you don't really notice people in the background because the editing doesn't let you. Culpeper is as two-dimensional as Catherine is brainless. You don't buy for a moment that the two of them have feelings for each other. As for Catherine's relationship with Henry, it's unremarkable. Ray Winston could be talking to a plank of wood and nothing would change. Like with Anne Boleyn, I think I should save Catherine's downfall until the next video as her definitive moment. Plus, this segment is long enough, but after Catherine very publicly lets Culpeper put a necklace on her while she's naked in the tub, I think the successive scenes of her getting arrested can be best summed up with that shocked Pikachu meme. Like, what did you think was going to happen, you cream-faced loon? More of your screen time would infect my brain.
Wine tonight.
This is your new stepmother, child.
Dawn Adams? That's my aunt's name. I didn't know she was in this movie. About a decade before she was born. Young Bess is not good. Beneath its theatrical acting and colourful costumes, which, to its credit, does show the Tudor court as far more vibrant than most Tudor dramas, the main plot is a sickening slap in the face to what Thomas Seymour did to Lady Elizabeth. But that's not Dawn Adams' fault. We'll get to that awful thing when we get to Catherine Parr's rankings, and perhaps Thomas Seymour if my patrons request it. We're more likely to cover Thomas Seymour before we cover Elizabeth I. Catherine Howard is little more than a cameo. The problem is she's 23, and she looks 23. That's a year younger than Jean Simmons, who, I will remind you, is meant to be playing a 10 to 14-year-old for the main bulk of this film. She's shown wrestling Henry's goblet away from him, showing that the two of them had at least some affection towards one another. Catherine enters the scene when little Elizabeth, pre-growth spurt, is brought to court to meet her. Charles Lawton is back as Henry VIII, and he's amped up the creepy now he's 54, a year younger than Henry VIII himself when he died. In my opinion, his Henry VIII walked so that Keith Michelle's could run. Sorry, tangent. There's so little to say here that I want this entry to be at least a minute long. Following Anne Boleyn's death, the next three wives pass in a montage. Jane Seymour is mentioned but never shown, while Anna of Cleves is an off-screen voice. Catherine Howard actually gets to appear as a stepmother, who Elizabeth dares to like and get close to. To make up for the lack of time spent with each wife, body language does a lot of the heavy work. In the brief scene with Anne Boleyn, Henry starts rubbing his hand on her neck, which then fades to her execution. When Catherine Howard is introduced to Elizabeth, he repeats the same action. Before the viewer's alarm bells start ringing, Catherine is in the same position as Anne. Though why she rests her chin on the block, I don't know. Come on, Catherine, you rehearsed this. If your neck is at an angle on the block, the only place the axe is going is straight into your jawbone. The Hays Code prevented a lot of movies into presenting conflicts as anything other than black and white. And we all know the story of Henry and his wives was far more complex than who was good and who was bad. Of course, Henry dies, so that appeases the code's demand that anyone who murders their spouse on screen can't be allowed to live. But with the wives, the institution of marriage can't be shown to be violated, so the downfalls of the beheaded wives are relegated to vague narration. The Hays Code is also why Jane Seymour is never mentioned, because childbirth was a no-no in their eyes. At least she serves a purpose to the plot. Not only is she the reason that Elizabeth is so guarded, but just as Elizabeth has come to love Catherine Parr as her new mother, Henry's putting his hand on her neck, which triggers Elizabeth. It's an interesting use of show don't tell, but it doesn't save this problematic movie.
What a pretty arrangement. The joint goes out and bang, the sweets come in. Oh, Catherine. Oh, well, if the king were not a king, what would you call him? What would you call him? I'll tell you.
No, tell me. If I were not a king, what then?
Catherine Howard is the only character in this movie with a full story arc from beginning to end. She's there on the day of Anne Boleyn's execution as one of the ladies replacing Anne's initials with Jane's, and starts speaking her mind about Henry's callousness. Unbeknownst to her, Henry's standing in the doorway. Catherine shows herself intelligent by saying something to flatter the king, and she doesn't flare up his anger. She remains at court in the years following Jane Seymour's death and starts the courtship with Thomas Culpeper. But this isn't enough. She wants more. She knows the king wants another wife. Why can't it be her? When she has married the king, she realises she's thrown away a proper, true love with Culpeper to a meaningless marriage with an egotistical monster. For a major female character in a 1930s movie, the arc is pretty well done. It's almost a proto-Scarlett O'Hara told in 1/6 of the runtime of Gone with the Wind. But this isn't the Catherine Howard of history. This is a fictional character worked into the Tudor court. I don't hate it because it's well written and clearly the story was more important to this film than the historical accuracy. So I've put it at number 5 by default, as the rest are far more attached to actual events. Binny Barnes clearly isn't a teenager in this. In fact, she was 30, a good 9 years older than Jane Seymour's actress Wendy Barry. Suddenly casting 20-year-olds doesn't seem so strange now, does it? Frances Derham doesn't make an appearance and is instead composited with Thomas Culpeper. One thing I do like about this film is that Culpeper and Catherine are established in their relationship, so it doesn't come out of nowhere when she is married to Henry. As I said, this Catherine is very much like Scarlett O'Hara by using her charm and wit to get what she wants, but never actually gets to be with someone she loves. It also carries airs of Romeo and Juliet, with the two lovers being star-crossed. Here's a tip for you English literature students watching. Star-crossed doesn't mean something romantic, it means doomed. I can understand why this would be the interpretation in the 1930s, because sources were still quite blurry on what Culpeper and Catherine's relationship was really like. Perceiving them as a tragic romance is fine for the context of this movie, but again, as you'll find out, Culpeper was not romantic. Overall, this is a Catherine, but it's not our Catherine.
Lord, you must forgive me, Master Culpeper. I am lecturing you like an old schoolmaster, and here I am, only a year out of the schoolroom. I feel as old and as wise as a desert hermit.
This version of Catherine Howard was too much of a bully to be likeable in my opinion. When I first watched this series, my immature mind that had grown up on movies that were full of toxic slut-shaming and anti-feminism, I didn't realise it back then, unfortunately, concluded that Catherine IRL was a dumb slut. And this series did nothing to change my mind. But the entry after this did change my mind, albeit indirectly. Catherine's opening scene doesn't present her as someone I want to root for. And I'm sorry to say, but I think these opening scenes needed rearranging. We start with Catherine telling another girl in the dormitory about her affair with Derham, but she reveals her cruel and bullying nature almost immediately by threatening to strike her friend for giggling. And then we have a long scene of her talking to the Duke of Norfolk, where she acts incredibly innocent and naive. Afterwards, Catherine returns to the dormitory and continues to threaten the other girl. If you want to show that your character presents a facade to superiors that can advance them, the audience / reader / player / listener needs to see that facade first, and then show them what they're like with when no one is watching and sharing a scene with someone of no significance to them. Because that can show how good this character is at lying, and perhaps even show why they're doing what they're doing. The only exception is to gain dramatic irony, but you can't do that for the sake of doing it, otherwise it's like making the audience privy to spoilers for no reason. If you were watching Toy Story 2 and you knew straight after being introduced to the prospector that he was the bad guy, his sudden turning on the other characters wouldn't have been as shocking, would it? Also, I can't forgive how mean she is to Will Summers. On this channel we stan Will Summers. I understand that you want me to empathise with her after the wedding night when she recalls how she realised the truth about Henry, where she thought he was actually strong and muscular under all those big clothes, albeit altered by age. He is in fact a morbidly obese, extremely unhealthy man with rotten flesh for legs. That is horrifying, and realising you have sacrificed your youth to be married to such a man who can't even sleep with you because he's impotent leaves you in an unwinnable situation with no security. If this was the realisation made by another version of Catherine on this list, apart from Emily Blunt of course, I would feel sorry for her. But I don't here because I know that she is cruel and unkind when she's with people she doesn't feel are important to her. I want to say Angela Pleasance did a good job, but this episode suffers from a case of how do you do fellow kids syndrome. That is a term I just made up, where it doesn't matter how good a performance the actor does, if they're meant to be a specific age but they are clearly older than their character, the observer cannot get it out of their head. I think Ben Platt in Dear Evan Hansen makes a more convincing 17-year-old. The episode's redeeming feature, I think, is the plot lines of two characters who make their last appearance here, and their relationship with Catherine. The first is obviously Patrick Troughton's Duke of Norfolk, where he presents a fatherly heir to her until he finds out about Derham and is quick to throw her under the bus to save himself. Of all the Doctor Who's turned evil that I've seen, I think this one is my favourite. But Thomas Howard deserves his own rankings, which will again be up to the patrons once we've finished with the Six Wives. The other character, of course, is Lady Rochford, who has gone from a schemer trying to advance herself and be free of her loveless marriage to being a maternal figure to Catherine. She has been rewritten to have been Catherine's governess since the death of Jane Seymour, giving them more of a solid bond and actually providing a reason as to why Lady Rochford would assist in the Culpeper affair. In reality, we don't really know why Lady Rochford did what she did. Finally, we can talk about Francis Derham in a full analysis. We get a few scenes with him, but not enough to really leave an impact. The only thing that really sticks out is when he's talking to Culpeper before they are both executed, where he tells Culpeper that it's ridiculous that he has to suffer the traitor's death just for loving someone who by mere chance became the Queen of England. I want to feel sorry for him, but considering what his real-life counterpart did to Catherine, I don't care. And Thomas Culpeper, I don't know why, but he feels like that protagonist in a romantic comedy who's meant to be sweet and innocent, but in reality he's actually creepy and entitled and really, really stupid. Plus, I'm annoyed that he wasn't in the previous episode because I have all of a few minutes to actually get to know this character before he is macking on Catherine and getting himself executed. I think this is the weakest episode of the series, and clearly there wasn't as much love devoted to it, as Catherine is quite forgettable and it survives only on the backs of the other actors. I honestly don't see any chemistry between Henry and Catherine. They don't actually spend much time together. They meet, then it's the wedding night, then after the wedding night, then this brief scene here, and then that's it. To be honest, I only watch this episode when I'm watching the others. Here's a fun little tidbit though. Angela Pleasance is one of a handful of actresses who have played both a wife of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Guess what she played her in?
Doctor, my sworn enemy. Off with his head! What?
Don't touch me. Don't ever touch me like that. You don't think you're the only one, do you? I have a store of other lovers beside you. Now get out! Get out!
I'm sure that you all expected this sooner and higher on the list, but in truth, I don't actually hate it. I certainly don't hate it as much as other people do. This version of Catherine Howard is like a pastry that I quite like, but someone crammed it with raisins. And in this case, the raisins are pointless nudity and sex scenes. So I'm going to engage in the unpleasant task of picking out all the raisins so I can actually enjoy the pastry. And let me start out by saying I'm not going to be mean to Tamsin Merchant here. I can be rude and brutally honest without too many regrets. But being mean is not something I intentionally do or want to do. Shaming her because she got naked would be like attacking Megan Fox for being eye candy in the Transformers movies. And it's not as if she's the only actress in this entire series to get naked. Throughout the 4 seasons of The Tudors, it has a lot of something for the dads. In the first season, there were boobs in every episode, but after the audience was locked in, the boob count slowly dropped. It is uncanny how much this and Game of Thrones have in common. But many a big studio executive thinks that to get the menkind interested in history or fantasy, they need to plaster soft pornography over everything. But I think the producers were starting to worry that the perverts wouldn't watch anymore if they didn't have a character taking it off every episode that she was in. And I say she because we never get a nude scene with a guy unless it's from the waist up. And that is so very annoying. If you're going to show female nudity, the least you can do is level the playing field and show male nudity as well. There's a lot of thirsty women in the audience, guys. All nudity or no nudity, so saith the feminist. When I found out that Tamsin Merchant was going to be Catherine Howard, I was actually kind of interested because I immediately thought of that scene in Pride and Prejudice, which showed that she could play a sweet and friendly character. I would have preferred it if this was the kind of person they went for and not a disturbing insight into the writer's fetishes. And she giggles way too much. It's just not natural. I know I keep saying this for a lot of actors when they show up on my rankings videos, but for the part she was given, Tamsin played it well, and I would rather see a 20-year-old, a consenting adult, play this role than someone who is actually 17. Plus, Tamsin is petite enough to still at least have the illusion of still being a teenager. One thing I'd like to expand on in the next video is what happened to the women who were both in The Maiden's Daughter with Catherine and later served her at court. Obviously they couldn't include every person in the same drama, mainly because the viewer wouldn't be able to keep track of them. That's just the way things are. So the bulk of the women who were with Catherine in the Duchess's household are represented with Joan Bulmer. The real Joan Bulmer might not have ever been invited to court, but she certainly paid the price for knowing Catherine back then. I find it strange that this was the one they chose, not Malin Tilney or Alice Restwold. Maybe they pulled names out of a hat, I don't know. This was actually the drama that made me realise Catherine wasn't just a stupid slut, because, believe it or not, Catherine actually is aware that this can come crashing down if she makes the wrong move. Like in history, she doesn't give herself away by being caught with Culpeper, so she at least has that going for her. I don't think I'd have the same sympathy for her if she had deliberately flirted with Culpeper in public and then be surprised when she's getting arrested. She is genuinely worried when Joan or Frances Derham merely references what happened before she became the Queen. But at the same time, she is incredibly naive. And I kind of interpret her having an affair with Culpeper because in her formative years she was led to believe that love and lust were interchangeable. After what Manox and Derham did to her, she is pushed in front of the king. Then naturally she would think the only way to gain the king and to keep him is to be as sexually available as possible. I'll talk about Culpeper in a minute, but I think that while the Tudors never actually admit that Catherine was a victim of sexual abuse, I can sense it under the surface. Had this series come out 10 years later, this would have been more obvious.
Madam, she was a young girl left in your care. She was a child. But several men took advantage of her under your nose and you didn't know?
Of course, I'm no psychologist, but it is listed by noted psychologists that reckless behaviour and promiscuity are symptoms of trauma for sexual abuse. I did genuinely believe that Henry had a proper affection for her because she let him relive his youthfulness, but just like the rest of his wives, he projected so much onto her that reality couldn't live up to it. With Henry, it ain't a pretty picture, his temper's short and his mate's a witcher. Right, now on to Derham and Culpeper. I think this is the best version of Derham, and the most accurate. Granted, that's not saying much, given how few versions there are, but my point still stands. He is a cocky and overconfident man, believing that the same attitude that seduced Katherine will make him successful at court as well. But when it's made clear that Katherine doesn't want him, he turns angry and violent. Derham is a bully, and I believe that's what the original Derham was like. In the next episode, when he is arrested, watching him crumple and grovel under the glare of Edward Seymour, who isn't even the most masculine guy in the series, is very satisfying. Plus, the actor looks a lot like a guy who used to beat me up when I was in school for the crime of just existing, so watching him get beaten down and disemboweled is cathartic in some way. And likewise, this is the best version of Thomas Culpeper so far. I think I would have liked to have seen him introduced in season 3 in the background, announcing other characters, but acknowledged verbally at some point by Henry. That way it wouldn't feel as if he sprung up out of nowhere when the plot required him. It's made very clear from the very first episode that Culpeper is not the lovelorn suitor, admiring his love from afar. This is shown when he uses his sexual frustration over Katherine by assaulting the parkkeeper's wife. There's a deleted scene where the king pardons him for it. I kind of wish it had been added in so his eventual execution would be more satisfying. Culpeper wants to have his way with Katherine because he feels entitled to her and slowly manipulates her into bed, by also manipulating Lady Rochford. When she rightly gets angry with him, he emotionally blackmails her until she's apologising for it. We're not meant to believe this is a love story. We're meant to believe that Katherine believes that this is a love story. I think a whole lot of people would have enjoyed it a lot more if they simply hadn't shoved in so many sex scenes to satisfy the perverts. It cancels out the fact that Culpeper is a manipulating, scheming bastard, just to meet some arbitrary quota. I'm all for some form of psychological thriller, which shows just how abusers manage to manipulate their victims for their own gains, without the victims realising. All that moaning really does get fatiguing when you're binge watching this series, because of course this series was not meant to be binge watched, it was originally made to be watched one episode per week. So little by little you just get bored of all those sex scenes.
She's faking it.
Honestly, by episode 4, I was far more turned on just listening to Colm Wilkinson's monologue about being a ghost.
You're dead.
Yes, but not yet at rest. The living don't know that the recent dead are always around them. Even the children think of nothing but stopping this endless motion, this rushing here and there, like doubles of our earthly selves.
And I can see you and hear you. You are Darcy.
I am not Darcy. I am nothing. If you reached out your hand to touch me, it would find only air.
Although anyone who's even a little bit phantom sexual would find that scene arousing. I don't understand why Katherine didn't get a ghost scene in the final episode, because she was one of the 4 out of 6 wives that were dead by the time Henry VIII was dying himself. I know she doesn't have a child with Henry whom she could chastise him over, but something would have sufficed. Perhaps she could have shared the scene with Anne Boleyn, as she is mentioned there, or maybe when Henry senses another ghost is nearby after Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn have had their say, Henry expects it to be Jane, as well as the audience, but instead it's Catherine. Or perhaps you could have a reference to the haunted gallery, where Henry keeps seeing her being dragged screaming away from him until he finally confronts the ghost. I know I'm looking at this from a post-Me Too perspective, and maybe I'm looking at this the way it could have been, not how it was. If one were to skip the sex scenes, it might be more enjoyable to an increasingly more aware audience.
Poor Catherine Howard. She lies in the cold ground next to me. Poor child. It was not her fault either. But we were like 2 moths drawn to the flame. And burned.
Not in such quantity, my darling. The
The treasury is not inexhaustible. If it were, we would have given you a public wedding at St. Paul's.
Forgive me.
You know I can refuse you nothing.
Yes, finally! This movie ranks above the Tudors. And that's because this is my favourite part of the film. This section barely takes up more than half an hour, but it is a credit to the actors that they can all be made solid enough in such a short amount of time. Continuing with my theory that the perspective of this movie is told through Henry VIII's biased lens, imagining Catherine as a playful and kind-hearted lass is fair game, because it did come to a surprise to him that she had a not-so-innocent past. Even on his deathbed, Henry still can't comprehend how she turned out to be not as innocent as she seemed. Lynn Frederick has a far more family-friendly interpretation where she acts like a child, but it's not in a creepy, sexy way for the dads. More a clear statement of her immaturity. The best thing about this movie is the use of body language to fill the gaps in the character development, as well as the little details in the background or right in front of your face. Take when Henry appears as the leaders of the Pilgrimage of Grace. He pretends to turn on Cromwell, but once the Yorkshiremen are gone, and Henry rounds on Bishop Gardiner and the Duke of Norfolk, you see Cromwell fluff up his robes with a smug look, knowing he's in the clear. When Henry goes to meet Anna of Cleves, you see him innocently look at each of the women in the hopes that one of them is the girl in the portrait. With Catherine, you see a range of different details. Among them is how the Duke of Norfolk grabs his niece's upper arm as he walks with her, showing both a lack of affection and how she has been forced into this marriage by others. Another detail I liked was after they're married, and to show just how much Catherine's status has changed, where she's wearing several necklaces at once when ladies would usually only wear 1 or 2 necklaces at most. But she probably has never had such a large range of jewellery before, so how is she supposed to decide which few she wants to wear? Why not wear them all at once? Later on, during the summer progress, there are all manner of little details that enrich the story. You have Henry constantly pawing at Catherine, demonstrating to anyone watching that he is claiming her as his property, and constantly pulling her in for kisses to show his dominance. But for all Catherine's smiling, she takes whatever moments she can to steel herself, and sees a little resolve to go on pretending that she is okay with being pawed at by a much older man. Francis Derham has but a brief cameo, and for some reason he has a scar on his face, possibly to distinguish him from others. But this is fair, given that this is from Henry's perspective, and he barely knew Derham and would probably have only seen him for a few times, at most, before the scandal erupted, and probably never even spoke to him. He popped up out of nowhere and ruined his blissful fantasy. But I think the gem of this story arc is how it has been set up as far back as Anne Boleyn's tenure when Henry injures his leg. Thomas Culpeper is addressed by name, bringing another horse for the king to ride. When Henry falls, he and Charles Brandon come running. You see Culpeper pop up several times afterwards, talking with the Seymours and defending his master from beggars. As a result, you see the affection that Henry gained towards Culpeper. So when he finds out that Thomas betrayed him, he goes full on Darth Vader. It's a bit jarring tone-wise, but we need a bridge between Catherine's confession and her execution. It isn't clear how malicious Culpeper might have been, but Henry's perspective has classed him as a faithful servant and nothing else. These wives get very nicely paced build-ups, but they disappear so fast. I keep saying it, but I wish this movie hadn't been so short.
Break out your ears under Catherine, who lost her head for my promiscuity outside of wed. Lock up your husbands, lock up your sons. Kay Howard is here and the fun's begun.
This might be a controversial decision, but I came to it a good few months before I saw the musical on stage, and then actually watching it pretty much solidified the decision. The previous lists were really varied in quality. Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn's lists were half and half of which were good, which were bad, which were good actresses in a bad movie, which were bad actresses in a good movie, while Jane Seymour has ridden on a wave of neutrality. And we've taken what we can get with Anne of Cleves. But for Catherine, it's been a real chore. Of course, this musical has been written after the Me Too movement, a movement that has taken full control of my perspective of history. This is the first properly honest look at what happened to Catherine Howard. It brings you in with comedy, but once you're past the point of no return, the reality trap snaps shut. The first time I saw Six's interpretation of Catherine Howard, I was like, oh, she's meant to be Ariana Grande, especially since Amy Atkinson, the original Catherine in the soundtrack and in the West End, bears a heavy resemblance to Grande. But the second I heard that she was also based on Britney Spears, I was like, okay, let's listen to the song. Oh, I can't wait to... This is the perfect bait and switch, as well as a stark and sudden punch as you realise that this is also a reflection of how many young women and girls have been exploited just like Catherine Howard has. It doesn't matter if values were different in the 16th century. If we class an abused teenager as a victim of grooming and sexual molestation now, it's applicable then. Catherine's sexy appearance and intro in Ex-Wives are all a facade, hiding the painful psychological damage she's been through. Both she and Anne Boleyn happily get sarcastic, but the difference is that with Anne Boleyn, what you see is what you get. She is brutally honest and doesn't apologise for it. But for Catherine, it's a method of self-defence. She thinks that if she makes light of what happened to her, it won't hurt as much, but it does. Her intro starts as the other queens are dismissing her as the least relevant Catherine, and how she can't compete with their stories. Catherine, without missing a beat, starts to roast the rest of them before jumping straight into her song. This is my favourite song on the soundtrack for a reason. If you can see this on stage, I urge you to do so at the earliest opportunity, granted you also take care of yourselves with the whole pandemic going on. I'm glad I waited to see it first before I got to writing this script. Catherine is centre stage, with the rest of the wives surrounding her. Throughout the song they get closer and put their hands on her. In each verse, Catherine recalls her relationships with the 4 men in her life. First is Henry Mannix. The musical instruments and the terms she refers to all carry a double meaning. But the first thing to knock the audience off balance is her mentioning the vast age difference between the two. Once you twig the double meaning, you realise all these sexual things are being done to a 13-year-old. He tells her they have a connection. Bit creepy, but you know. She's convinced they're meant to be together. This intensifies in the next verse about Francis Derham. From the lyric, "Gets what he wants and he won't take no," your skin crawls just a little bit more. And it doesn't take long to realise what his favourite quill and the ink that she spills actually refers to. Immediately, Catherine's forgotten about Mannix and decides Derham is the one. He tells Catherine they have a connection, and she is convinced that Derham is different. At the halfway point, we finally get to Henry VIII. His advances are far more literal by making her a lady in waiting and giving favours to her family. Henry is clinging to her emotionally, and Catherine feels that she's actually got purpose now she's at court. But the moment Henry tells her they have a connection, Catherine takes it as an emotional blow, knowing what the king really wants from her, and how this isn't so different from her last 2 relationships. The final blow comes in the final verse. Catherine finds Thomas Culpeper as a friend she can rely on to be there for her, as being Henry VIII's wife is quite a strain. She says they hang out loads when the king's away, but that doesn't actually confirm if they slept together or not. Rather, they just met in private a lot. All Catherine wants is a friend, someone who understands her. Thomas is devoted, and everything seems happy, until he says that they have a connection. At that moment you realise Catherine is covered in the hands of the rest of the queens. She tries to fight them off, but there are too many of them. This is obviously a representation of how Catherine has been taken advantage of so many times, as well as a reference to pop stars that do a lot of body touching in their choreography, and a nod to Catherine being pulled down the haunted gallery at Hampton Court trying to beg Henry for her life. Yeah, you thought this was going to be a fun little musical asking what it would be like if the 6 wives of Henry VIII were the Spice Girls. But this is where the shoe drops and reveals it has never been that kind of show. All these ladies have been mistreated, but Catherine was handled the worst of all, not just by Henry, but by the other men who hurt her and others who didn't put a stop to her predators soon enough. These men don't care about her. They only want to use her and patronise her as they call her the fairest of the fair. Thankfully, in the alternate future that the queens choose for themselves at the end, Catherine quickly rebuffs Henry Mannix before he can do anything to her, thereby evading the abuse from the other men. She teaches herself how to play musical instruments and sing. She sings for pleasure and will sing for the rest of her life. I'd like to think that she also started a YouTube channel where she not only sings her own songs, but also sings covers of show tunes. Oh boy, that was a saga and a half. But I think it's clear that a lot of the Catherines on this list are misrepresentations at best, and the worst ones are just malicious. Next time we'll be talking about how she gets caught or whatever, from the moment that letter reaches Henry to the moment the axe swings. There is so much about Catherine Howard that has been misrepresented over the past years or dismissed as her being a silly little girl. I'm not saying she was completely flawless or a tragic angel too good for this sinful world, but I've read enough books to know that this leans more towards the Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Justine kind of narrative. She wasn't a Madonna, nor was she a whore. Catherine Howard was a bloody human being. And for so long, I was just as bad as those assholes that wrote her off as a slut. Oh, she used her body for her own pleasure, even though these men were much older than her. What a bitch.
You all have got to stop calling each other sluts and whores. It just makes it okay for guys to call you sluts and whores.
I've been feeling so guilty about thinking that way since The Tudors wrapped up its final episode. On top of her definitive moment, the next video will be my official apology to Catherine Howard for being such a close-minded, judgmental bitch. But I am still sparing no wrath from how horribly some of these on-screen incarnations and a handful of historians, Dan Jones, have slandered her. So that was the video. Okay guys, just because the main bulk of the video is over doesn't mean we're finished. Okay, so don't switch off yet, because we have the captions now. Next month we'll have our part 3 of Catherine Howard, as well as the Pearl Harbor rankings. I hope you have a safe Christmas. I hope you look after yourselves. I've literally just gotten home from getting boosted. Like, my arm is still pretty sore from it, but, you know, I was originally going to get it done on the 30th, but then I got a text from my GP. They were saying, oh, you can go and get it done here if you like, really soon. And I was like, sure. Like, if you can get it done sooner, take that opportunity. I'm going to say a big thank you and happy holidays to my patrons who have been so wonderful to me. Honestly, a year ago, I just finished my first video, and I mean, I'm pretty proud of myself to get about 3,000 subscribers within my first year. I didn't think I was going to get 1,000 by this time, and you know, let alone attract any patrons. And I'm so grateful that my patrons are here to show their support. And if you guys want to support the channel as well, you can go onto Patreon and you can support the videos. You can have your name featured in the credits like these lovely people. You can get early access to scripts and early access to videos, depending on what tier you choose. And VIP patrons like Anastasia Gracia, Alison Cuff and Larissa will always get a special shout out in the credits afterwards. Alternatively, you can always make sure that you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos coming out, and you leave a like and a comment just to help boost me up that algorithm ladder. So for those of you who are new, we have captions at the end of every rankings video. I pick a frame while I'm editing, I put it in a post before I'm finished editing, I get you to make captions of it, and then we just have a laugh at the end of the rankings. So this time it was of Jonathan Rhys-Meyers again. I'll try not to take advantage of Jonathan Rhys-Meyers next time, slamming the desk like so. I've spotted that frame when I was editing part 1 back when I had my old laptop, and I thought, oh, we'll keep that in mind if we can't find a better image to caption. And right now I'm just editing the last few sections, and I just thought, you know what, let's just use this one. Insert meme of Henry VIII saying, "Tell me how I'm supposed to breathe with no air. Where is the king going with that girl?" And then Cardinal Wolsey's like, "Oh, I don't know, madam, I suppose he's just going out for a little air." And then she's like, "How many more airs does he want?" When you sit down after leg day in the gym, I get that, especially when you go into the gym and you have sciatica, because I've had sciatica bug me for about a year now. Finally, I managed to take care of it. Alan, I can't have you sniffing about when I'm trying to do my filming. This one's not really a caption. Just talking about the comments in the Tudors about Tamsin Merchant's bottom. Yeah, they definitely had a standard for body shape. That thing I said in the Emily Blunt caption about the tiny boobs, I'm not shaming anyone for having tiny boobs. If anything, I envy you, because I know you have never left John Lewis in tears because you couldn't afford a really ugly bra that you really needed. Alan, will you stop licking the floor? What the hell can be on the floor that's so delicious you have to lick it? Why would you say that? Like, you put me in such an uncomfortable situation. You know I'm not happy. You know how I feel. It was just like, spider! That was what I thought of when I found that frame. I was just like, lol, imagine if there was just a spider and it's just like... They say that there was no Christmas party. There was no Christmas party. For those of you who don't know, if you're watching this like long after the day it's been released, there's been a bit of a scandal in Downing Street and indeed in other cabinet offices where it's been found that illegal Christmas parties took place last year when we were in lockdown, and while the Home Secretary was telling people to snitch on their neighbours for having Christmas parties, and anyone who was caught at a Christmas party would get fined about 10 grand, they were all in Downing Street having cheese and wine and doing a quiz. And despite extreme evidence that a party did indeed take place, like, the Tories are just trying to deny its existence. And I think, yeah, this is a moment, but it is very, very apt for this quote. Well, if Henry VIII was in charge during this pandemic, I think it would have been handled a lot better because he actually put his trust in doctors and he was a hypochondriac. He was terrified of disease. So I think he would have taken it a lot more seriously. I mean, there would have been that whole giving contracts to your friends thing, which he probably would have done. I mean, of course, I'm not saying that Henry VIII would have been perfect, but just saying he probably would have been better than what we've got right now. So I decided to take a break from boys, and you'll never guess who I met. Actually, it's the other way, isn't it? Me when someone says that Anne Boleyn had a sixth finger. Yeah. I used to get into a lot of fights of that during when I was in school because I was obsessed with Anne Boleyn. They'd be like, "Oh, you know she had a sixth finger," and I was like, "No, she didn't." And they're like, "Oh yeah, but this thing specifically said no, like, no. I can cheat on my wives. It's effing normal. Why doesn't anyone get that?" When you're Jonathan Rhys-Meyers on the set of The Tudors and another cast member has more sex scenes than you. I haven't done a tally, but I'm pretty sure Jonathan Rhys-Meyers gets the most sex scenes. Maybe Henry Cavill gets more. It's simple. All I want is a woman who could give me a son without her dying, not shag everything in sight, and not be Anne of Cleves. It's all I ever wanted. That crazy woman Amy from Amy's Baking Company, that Gordon Ramsay refused to help in Kitchen Nightmares, going mega Karen in the Twitter comments. If you haven't seen the clips, watch them and you'll know. My name is Henry VIII, and I gotta say, only supposed to blow the bloody doors off. What do you mean my beard makes me look old? I look awesome. He does look awesome with that beard. Honestly, Jonathan Rhys-Meyers looks a lot better in the later seasons than he does in the early one where he's just got that buzz cut. Gordon Ramsay when the food is raw. Yes. Okay, I have not seen Brooklyn Nine-Nine. My sister keeps nagging me to watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It's just the only reason I got my sister to watch Dark Crystal Age of Resistance was because I told her Andy Samberg was in it as a Skeksis and she was really, really excited. I wanted to insert a meme of anger from Inside Out blowing up, but it didn't work out for me. Oh well. That's okay. You know what? I saw your caption and I did this. So, Merry Christmas. This is Sparta! Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa now! When you've lost the argument but you keep yelling to make it look like you've won. Oh my god, who has not been in that sort of argument where you're with someone who is absolutely wrong and they will not shut up? I'm the injured party in all of this, once again. It's not fair. Why does my gentle heart keep on being used and abused? I'm a good person. I've never lied, except when necessary. I've always bought my wives expensive gifts. Using their credit cards, of course, but I do deserve this humiliation. Grab thee by the duckies. Oh, I see, yes. The upper duckies, not the lower duckies. You swan. I like it. Another! I'm not throwing that to the ground. I'll never be able to open this again. Me during history lessons when someone says that Charles V is father of Queen Marie Theresa, and I wasn't sure if that was the wife of Louis XIV or Marie Antoinette's mother, but yeah, Marie Antoinette's mother. I don't know how someone could make that mistake because there's a 200-year difference. Because if anything we learned from the Habsburg giant chin days was that it drastically shortened your life. It didn't make you live for 200 years. Me, when I heard that Channel 5 wants to make a series about Catherine Howard. Oh god, I really hope they don't. I mean, it's one thing to be all like patriarchy bad meh on Anne Boleyn because, yeah, pretty much the patriarchy did stand in her way. But with Catherine Howard, they're going to want to have their cake and eat it too. They're going to want to sex her up and then be all like, oh no, she was a victim. These guys aren't the Tudors. They can't cast well. They can't cast well. They can't write well. And they're like, oh, no. Oh no, we didn't really think of the story. We thought of casting first, and then we only had 5 minutes left to write a story. I mean, if they make a series, I'll watch it, and then you can hear me do another rant. I really hurt my throat doing that Anne Boleyn rant video, by the way. I need more thunderbolts! Henry Bologna would be that way. Karen's yelling and ranting at the manager when they aren't allowed to use their expired coupons for the clothes they're trying to buy at Walmart. And yes, Henry VIII is the king of Karens, for lack of a male equivalent. Well, I think we decided on the Anne Boleyn video that we're going to call all male Karens Barrys. So yes, Henry was a Barry. I want to talk to the manager. The manager's in Rome. Well, send the manager here. The Pope can't come all the way just to sort out your marriage problems, Henry. Well, I will be the manager. Yeah, so who knows where we'll be next year? Hopefully with better camera equipment.